Okay. Yes. And if any of you have any questions about methods, or if you think that I've been unclear, just raise your hand and I can answer it, because I think just being lectured at can be a bit boring. So feel free to ask questions at any point, because I prefer for this to be a dialogue. But yes, so the ecology and biodiversity in Lake Titicaca. And first of all, as Alexander said, Lake Titicaca is very far away from Ukraine and also very far away from Britain. So I wouldn't blame you for not being the most familiar with it. So Lake Titicaca is a high altitude lake shared between Peru and Bolivia. It is 3,814 meters in elevation. So that is significantly higher than anything in Britain. I believe that is higher than anything in Ukraine at the moment, but I may be wrong. But yeah, it's a unique ecosystem. It's a Ramsar wetland. It's an important bird area as recognized by BirdLife International. And it's a very biodiverse area as well. So here you see Albert's classification of the freshwater biogeographic regions of South America. Now, South America has the greatest freshwater biodiversity of any continent in the world, though admittedly South America, take any given biodiversity category, probably South America has the most of it. It's sort of an absolute naturalist paradise. But here you can see the various biogeographic regions. Lake Titicaca is that purple one down in the middle. I'm not sure if you can you see my mouse going over it there? It's that one there. So it is the smallest, but it is also one of the ones that is most endemic. The lake has been there in various forms for about 6 million years since the Andean uplift. And because of that, but the lake levels have gone up and down significantly several times over this period. So you've had significant time for allopatric speciation. So you have a large number of species complexes, and you have a large number of endemic species. So over 90% of the invertebrates and 90% of the fish species found in that lake are endemic to that lake or to the connected bodies of water. And very often they're endemic to very specific parts of the lake. So despite the fact that it is relatively species poor compared to, say, the Amazon basin, it has a very high degree of beta diversity and high degree of endemicity. And therefore it's quite worth studying. However, unfortunately, there's a lot of species at risk there. I'd say my background is as an ornithologist, so obviously I will mention that there's 45 aquatic bird species that live in this lake, one of which you will hear a lot about because it was the subject of my doctoral thesis, the Titicaca flightless grebe, which you will see there. But you also have the critically endangered Titicaca giant frog, which is, you can see an image of it there, which is sometimes called the scrotum frog, because that's what it looks like when it's out of the water. You have the endangered Orestias killifish complexes, a couple of which have not been seen since the 1960s and are probably extinct, but some of which have been sporadically seen. You have several of these other species here, such as the Oxura ferruginea, which, depending on which ornithological authority you go with, is either a subspecies of a very widespread duck or a duck which is only found in the high Andes. So I leave that to the taxonomists amongst you to decide. Rowland's grebe at the bottom there, which is relatively closely related to the Titicaca flightless grebe and is found throughout the Andes and all the way down to the Falklands, but is also endangered due to climate change. So it's an ecosystem which has a lot of these species that are at risk. And why are they at risk? A big one of it is fisheries, bluntly. Now, the weird thing is that you'd think that for an area which is a massive lake surrounded by relatively arid, high-altitude grassland, fisheries would be an important part of the economy of the region forever. And looking actually at the archaeological record and at the historic ethnographic record, so anthropologists that went there in the 19th century, and also accounts of the region going back to the 16th century, because we do have written records from the Spanish colonial period, including some written by post-conquest indigenous people, like Garcilaso de la Vega, who wrote about agriculture and the like in the region. Fishing actually doesn't appear to have been a very major component of the diet of most people until the mid-20th century. And a big part of that is because even though you do have fish in the lake, the largest of the native fish species is only about 6 to 8 centimeters large at its largest. It isn't really a useful resource for food. But But that changed in the mid-20th century with the introduction of salmonids, lake trout, brown trout, rainbow trout. And I should say this introduction was done with the best of intentions. It was actually one of the first major projects done by the FAO, the UN Food Agency, which was doing a project funded by the Canadian government in 1951 to deal with the fact that there was protein deficiency in this region. So the main diet of the native people around here historically is potato. That's it. And in various forms. A potato can be very nutritious and will keep you alive, but it does have deficiencies in protein. So the idea was stock the lake with fish, which can grow in lakes, which we know can grow in lakes quite well, and therefore that will lead to a decline of protein deficiency, and it did. Of course, this being the early 1950s, they didn't do an environmental impact assessment beforehand, and it turns out invasive salmonids are a bit of a problem. You also have other issues in the lake. You have things like illegal mining, which occurs within the watershed, especially for gold. That has become more of an issue in the last 20 years. And the easiest way to get gold out of the rock is through methyl mercury, which leads to leaching into the waterways, which is less than ideal, to say the least. You also have climate change, which is causing there to be a shorter and shorter rainy season. And this is an endorheic lake, so its water comes from the rain. So we're seeing steadily declining lake levels, which is also less than ideal. And then you also just have other pollution caused by human effluence, because this is both of these countries are developing countries, and their infrastructure for wastewater treatment can be suboptimal at times. And very often there are laws around these topics, but there's a problem with enforcement of these laws, either due to lack of state capacity or, well, mainly lack of funds and lack of state capacity in this region. So I'll be talking a lot about this one species. Again, by the end of this talk, I'm sure you'll grow sick of the Titicaca grebe. I didn't after 4.5 years, but I was told that I was talking incessantly about it. And it's an absolutely wonderful species as far as I'm concerned, because if you're an ornithologist, it violates a lot of the rules that you think a bird should be. For one thing, obviously it's flightless. We're used to flightless birds, penguins and rheas and the like. That's not the weirdest thing. The other weird thing is that it cannot walk on land either. It is an entirely aquatic, it's as close to a fish as you get in a bird. It's sort of, when it tries to go on land, its legs are built in such a way that it snaps under its own weight. And occasionally you do see that, and it's very tragic. But its entire life, from its building its nests on the water, on these anchored nests, which, to be fair, several other grebe species do. That seems to be a basal trait in Podicippidae. To reproduction, to foraging, everything is done on the water. And we don't know a lot about this species because it is entirely endemic to this one lake in South America. Within this lake, it is the apex predator, but that's more of an indication that there aren't many other predators there. But what little we do know, and we know a lot more since my doctorate than before it, is that the population was not doing great. There was a population survey done in 1983. There was another one done in 2002, and it showed a 70% decline in the populations between the two. Now, both of these were, as those of you who are wildlife biologists will know, estimating populations from wild, without mark recapture methods have a large margin of error, but 70% is well beyond that margin of error. It is a real decline that we saw in those 20 years. So, and unfortunately, this is typical for a lot of grebes that live in lakes. So there's 3 grebes that have gone extinct in the 20th century: the Colombian grebe, the Atitlan grebe, and the Alautora grebe. All of them were endemic to one lake, in Atitlan and Alautora, that's the name of the lake, in Guatemala and in Madagascar. The Colombian grebe was in Lake Tauta in Colombia. 2 of the 3 were flightless. The third could just about fly, but, not particularly well. So it's thought that these species are quite vulnerable to anthropogenic change. And because this is one of the 2 last endemic grebes to one lake, the worry is, will it go extinct in the 21st century? Hopefully by the end of it, you'll have cause to believe that we have cause for optimism, but we're not out of the woods yet. So the first thing I had to do in my doctorate was to estimate, well, what's the status of this thing? Sorry. Because obviously, if you don't know the population, you don't know what conservation challenges to do. And as I mentioned, there's been a number of surveys done of this species. So 79, 83, you're going back to the 19th century, 1937. I mean, some of these older surveys are using methodologies which I confess would probably not stand the test of time for today. You know, sort of, I looked at it, I looked at the flock and it looked like there were roughly 500 of them. That's basically sort of Vogelwelt Bolivians' method. And you know, I can talk about these historic studies if you'd like, and about the various characters of ornithology that have come through the lake. You'll notice several of them are by John Fjeldza. He's the chap who probably knows the most about grebes in the world, to be honest. He wrote a big textbook on it, and he's still alive, funnily. So if you're interested in working on grebes, you can email him, and he does reply to his emails, which I can vouch for. And obviously, the first thing to do was, well, at the start of my doctorate, I hadn't done the field work yet, but I needed something to present to my examiners for my transfer of status. I'm not sure if that's how the doctoral process works in Ukraine. And I thought, well, we know that this grebe nests in these wetlands made of these sedges called Totora, Schronoplectus californicus subspecies Tatora. And we can perhaps see how has the extent of these wetlands changed since 2000 or so, since the last survey, based on satellite data. And that was work I did with Peter Long, formerly of the University of Oxford. He's now at Oxford Brookes. And we got a bit of an odd result, which we weren't expecting. We actually see that the amount of wetland in the lake appears to have increased since the year 2000. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best habitat for the grebe, because when we did this study, we just had description saying the grebe breeds in wetlands. Later fieldwork, which we did, actually showed that it's a bit more complicated than that. So this initial result, while interesting, because it does show that the wetlands are actually doing better than we thought, doesn't necessarily mean what we originally thought it would mean for the grebe. And that's, of course, those of you who've done natural history will know that you need to verify facts about animals, because animals very often are very inconsiderate and haven't read their entry in Birds of the World or other handbooks, and behave in ways which the handbook says they shouldn't, which really mucks up all sorts of things. They really should learn to follow the handbooks. But you can see here that a lot of this increase of wetlands has actually been in peripheral parts of the grebe's range. And when we went to visit those later in the fieldwork, we found that a lot of these places are, in theory, suitable habitat, but have not been colonized by the grebe because there's too much unsuitable habitat between them, primarily due to the climate change leading to a longer dry season. So we do have accounts from André Conter, in the 1990s, talking about how the grebe can rapidly colonize suitable territory, and that still appears to be true, but if the water level has dropped to the point that you no longer have the aquatic connection between the suitable territories, it cannot colonize that suitable territory. So the climate change is making it harder for the grebe to continue with its metapopulation structure, which is, we basically came to the conclusion by the end of doctorate that the grebe has a quasi-metapopulation structure in terms of how it survives year on year. And that's probably how it's been able to sustain itself over the last couple 100,000 years, or for however long the species has been around. We actually, funnily enough, even though we have genetic samples for almost all 11,000 bird species, this is one of the few which we don't. So its placement in phylogenetic trees is still based primarily on morphology. But Pete Hosner in Copenhagen is currently trying to get the genetic samples from this species to be able to see, how old it is and when did it branch and all that sort of thing. So that might lead us to reevaluating its evolutionary history. So the past studies in 2002, when they estimated its population, one thing that they did is basically take the population density of the grebe and extrapolate over the entire wetland of the area to see roughly how large it was. And in the absence of field data at this point, for this paper, we decided to do the same. And you can see that the margin of errors are absolutely massive. I'll preface to say that, of course, anyone who's used the Mladenov and Sicki method for estimating wild populations knows that it's better than nothing, but it will give you a massive error bar. And that is not it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good to report uncertainty. But that is a shortcoming of not having mark recapture methods. And we did try mark recapture. We didn't really succeed. So we do end up using the same sort of logic later on as well, which means that the population of the grebe still has massive error bars around it. But as I say, we went off to do field work. And we decided to do transects and point counts, depending on where we were. We did these repeatedly. We did these on both sides of the border. And we also took measures of where the fisheries were, because we knew from government reports and from the grey literature that one cause of concern for this species is fisheries bycatch, being caught by fishermen accidentally in the nets. But it's quite difficult to model the effect of that on the suitability of a landscape from satellite imagery alone or from bioclimatic variables. So we decided, well, if we can map the fisheries intensity over the landscape, then we can include that as a variable within our species distribution models later on. And there you can see Bolivia, Peru, and the protected areas, because there is, on the Peruvian side of the lake, there is a national park in Lake Titicaca, the Reserva Nacional del Titicaca. The chaps there do very good work with very limited resources that they have. And it is unfortunately limited resources. So there is an issue of poaching in the lake, but not of the grebe. The grebe the meat is apparently completely inedible. So it's not really a subject of poaching. The poaching is more of a risk for flamingos and coots and ducks. So the first thing was to do species distribution modeling. I'm sure the ecologists will be familiar with what species distribution modeling is, but I'm sure there's some non-ecologists here, so I'll just explain. Species distribution modeling is a family of models that has been developed over the last, I think, 24 years is when the first one was published. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's when Elith published maximum entropy modeling. The specifics don't matter, I suppose. And it basically takes occurrences of a species, ideally also absences, but you can also use pseudo absences. And it lets you then, and you put that on top of a raster or several rasters of what you think might drive the distribution of the species. So that might be temperature, precipitation, fisheries intensity in this case, the presence of pisciculture, urbanization, road networks, whatever you can think of. And there's various ways to then reduce the complexity of the model towards the ones that are most important for that species. And it gives you an output which looks like this, which is essentially what is the suitability of a landscape for a species. And I do want to emphasize that what this is telling you is the suitability, not necessarily, a species will not necessarily be found in every place that it is suitable, and there will also be individuals that are in unsuitable territory purely because they're being stubborn or for whatever reason, So it gives you a continuous result of the probability of finding a species there, essentially. And maximum entropy is one of the oldest of these models. It also, despite being one of the oldest, is one of the most robust. It makes one of the fewest assumptions, and it's one that works on occurrences only. Bayesian occupancy models, this is one which is a bit newer, but this one incorporates, if you need to have repeated visits to each site. So because we did repeated transects, it allows you to say, all right, we saw it this time, but we didn't see it next time, and we didn't see it next time. And you can incorporate variables that aren't about the environment, but about the survey. So maybe in one, the time you saw it, you spent 2 hours at this site, and the time you didn't see it, you spent an hour and a half. And you can incorporate that. Or you can say, well, you're on a team of researchers, and obviously when you're doing these counts, there's always more than one of you. And maybe the first time it was team A, and the second time it was team B. Or maybe it was raining one day, it wasn't raining the other day. Maybe you went out at 6 a.m. and the other time you went out at 7:30 a.m. All those sort of things can be incorporated in the model, and it gives you a slightly more accurate picture, but it is more labor intensive. We tried to use N-mixture modeling. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this. They are a very controversial family of models because they try to estimate abundance directly from count data. The model performed very poorly. So we do report that we did it in the paper. We have the results in the supplementals, but we don't trust it because the model diagnostics were very poor. We think the issue with admixture models is that they're very data thirsty. You really need a mountain of data, which maybe you can get for a species where you have a large team going over it over many years. But for sort of a doctoral project, which you have a 3 or 4 year window and you have a small group of people, primarily one person and then a couple of collaborators, is not as feasible to use. And I've since used a lot of other species distribution models. My current postdoc is basically focused on improving species distribution models. I may be taking on another postdoc in a couple of months, which would be also focused on these types of models. So if you want to talk about this family of models, I'm more than happy to do so. But as I said, we, in the absence of market recapture, we had a fallback on the Mladenov and Sicki logic of going, we know the population density from our surveys, and we do a bunch of different assumptions of how we do the cutoffs of favorability. And as you can see, depending on what assumption you make, you get absolutely ridiculous results. But assumption A, which was the most, yes, I see Natalia is laughing, and I'm not sure if you've worked with wild populations and estimating the populations of wild animals, but you can get ridiculous results if the assumptions you put in are insane. But I'm a believer in open science, so I believe in being transparent in what I report, including the bad ideas I had along the way. But model A is the one which I think makes the most realistic assumptions of what is actually favorable for the landscape, where it is, the probability of us seeing it and all that. And that's the one that gives you a population of probably around 10,000, which, given that in the late 1970s and 1980s, the population was around 20,000, and given that, given the population in 2003, roughly 10,000 is the most biologically plausible. I mean, some of these saying it's 40, 50,000 is bluntly not biologically plausible. You get those estimates in von Berlepsch's work in 1906, but his population estimate was essentially, his paper basically doesn't have a method section. It's just him saying, I went there, I saw them, this is how many I think there are, which clearly peer review was a lot more lax in those days than it is today. But yes, so the most conservative estimate, 8,000, yes, but the upper end is just insane. It's not 41,000. But even the lower estimate of the most conservative model does suggest an improvement from 2002, which is cause for, it's cause to think that something is going well. Especially since, actually, there hasn't been a concentrated conservation effort in Lake Titicaca for this species since then. So any improvement has been without active conservation work for this species. There now are conservation efforts for this species, but it would suggest that it is a fairly resilient species, which is quite good, obviously. And here you can see the drivers of where the species lives. Perhaps not shockingly, distance from shore is what most matters. If you are a species that needs to return to your territory in the wetlands every night, you're not going to go to the middle of a lake, especially when that lake is 180 kilometers at its longest point. And you're about yay big. You can't exactly go 60 or 70 or 80 kilometers. So they're pretty much only a coastal species. But the other thing is fishing intensity, which we did sort of expect it, but we didn't expect it to be that important. So it seems that its current distribution is very much constrained by where is fishing. And the more fisheries you have, the fewer grebes you have, which suggests that fisheries bycatch is not just a major source of mortality, it is probably the major source of mortality for this species. Unfortunately, we did include in one of our models how does being in the protected area affect it, and we were hoping to show that you're much more likely to find them in the protected area because the protected area is either A, covering the right habitat, or B, doing the right thing to protect this species, and we found no effect of being in a protected area. You can see it's, these are Bayesian effect sizes. It is bang on zero. So basically, either the protected area is not covering the right habitat, or they're so underfunded that they can't actually protect the habitat. And I think it's the second one, because the protected area covers most of the Peruvian wetlands. So it's quite a pity, I think, and hopefully they get more funding. But it is true that just the degree of poaching and illegal fishing in the wetlands does probably mean that the wetlands are not, the protected area is not as effective as it could be. The other aspect is simply that the main river that goes into the lake goes into the protected area, and that's where the highest methyl mercury concentration is in the lake. So that might be having an effect as well. We do have evidence that methyl mercury concentration affects egg survival and chick survival in this species, but not adult survival, which is a bit odd. So if any of you are specialists in that sort of field and you have any ideas, do let me know. Yes, I realize it's I'm going on a bit. So conservation is also about humans, and do people want to protect it? So we did a questionnaire and we took demographic information. We asked people, about the grebe. What do you think about the grebe? Are you willing to protect the grebe? And so on. And then we did a GLM with Poisson distribution, log link function, and then afterwards worked with some ethnographers and anthropologists and people who are specialists in qualitative methods. I admit I'm a specialist in quantitative methods, so I let them do their thing. And the main result is that most people, it turns out if you go to the street and ask someone, what do you think of this random bird? Most people will just look at you and say, I don't know, I've no opinion of it, which as an avid bird watcher, I find to be almost sacrilegious, but kind of makes sense. But fishermen tend to know more about the grebe, but tend to dislike it. And the main reason is because the grebe is competition for them. For context, I should say that the area around Lake Titicaca is the poorest part of South America. We're talking about a region where the average income is around 150 euros a month. So, it's not the wealthiest part of the world, I think is fair to say. And the grebe is seen as competition for fish because it eats fish and it breaks nets. Now, weirdly enough, once people stop fishing, they go back to not caring. So it's not a deep-seated cultural thing. It's not like wolves in the American West, where you have even people who are not ranchers despise them because they kill sheep. It's very much just economic self-interest, and that's fair enough. As I said, fisheries bycatch is a major issue, and most of the fisheries some of it is about the native species. Here you see some people collecting the fisheries of the native species. Fisheries is primarily done by women there, but you have a lot of fisheries bycatch, and along every dock of the lake you get dead grebes like this, unfortunately. And there's several barriers to studying fisheries bycatch. Even in Western Europe and North America, it's quite difficult to study it. Landing records, which you would need, are often fabricated even in Western Europe and New Zealand and the like. They straight up do not exist here. Most fisheries is just a farmer who has a boat that goes out in the morning and then farms the rest of the day. They're not taking records. A lot of them are illiterate. There's no money for an observer program. Many of the boats are quite small, so you probably wouldn't be able to have an observer program simply because it's not like commercial fisheries where you're talking about relatively few vessels. Here you'd be talking about literally thousands of vessels, each one with one guy. You can't have that many observers within a reasonable budget. So we tried to see if we could estimate the frequency of fisheries bycatch from interviews. Now, some of you who are clever than I am will see the issue with this, which in English they say, that a fish is the only species that grows after it's dead. That sort of fishermen will sometimes not be entirely honest about what they caught. I know, it's shocking. I confess I didn't really consider this that much. So we also had obviously done our surveys of the nets and of where they were and the fisheries intensity. And we thought we could combine the interview results with the modeling of fisheries intensity results to get through this equation here, roughly how many grebes are being caught a year. And we get this map, which works fairly well, and we get roughly, a big standard deviation of the number of nets, but that's primarily because fishers really do concentrate in the same areas. They don't put nets where there's pisciculture because that leads to conflict with the pisciculturists. And in this area, conflict is resolved by punches, and no one wants to get punched, or by, or harder methods. And they tend to concentrate near the shore because many of them can't swim, so they want to be sort of near enough that if they fall out of the water, they won't die. So it's relatively shallow areas that are being fished. If you thought the grebe population results were bad, this is even worse. Turns out, fishermen occasionally exaggerate. And when it comes to a thing that is annoying, and as far as they are concerned, they don't get why you, Johnny Foreigner, is interested in this pest bird, they'll just say, no, it falls in my net all the time, at least 4 or 5 times a week. And we've since done observer programs in one village, and we've compared what fishermen say how often grebes fall in their nets with how often they actually fall in the nets, and it's like this. It's sort of very little relationship. And that's why I think we got this insane result. So those of you who saw that trouble coming a mile off are clever than I am, because that was clearly a mistake on my part. Not saying that you can't work with local people. You should work with local people. Conservation needs to work with local people, but recognizing the biases and that people have, and not treating that everyone has a perfect memory of exactly what happened over the last year is probably a good thing. But as I say, we then did ground truthing. We worked with fishermen here. Here's some of them. And we have follow-up workshops. This is through money given to us by the British Ecological Society. These have been going on for 2 years now, so we now have 2 years of data. And we now have data, and every time a bird gets killed, we prepare it. And I taught lessons on how to prepare bird skins at the local university. The local university there now has a natural history museum, which it didn't before. It is almost entirely made out of dead birds, unfortunately. But we are now getting data on the demographics of the birds that are being killed. We're now seeing that it's not just grebes being caught in nets. So it's possible that actually maybe some of the exaggeration comes from the fact that when we asked how often does a grebe get caught in your nest, and even though we used the Aymara word for the grebe specifically, queñola, the capture of all these other species, diving ducks, Rowland's grebes, and the like, is being conflated with the Titicaca grebe. And in that case, the figures become a lot more biologically plausible. And we're getting a lot more demographic information about what species are falling and how often they're falling and what drives what falls in them. And that's work which we are preparing for a manuscript at the moment to do one big paper on fisheries bycatch in Lake Titicaca. But the interesting thing is almost all the grebes that get caught are either subadults or females. We very rarely get adult males. So we don't think this is because adult males are somehow cleverer and know how to go around the nets. One thing a lot of fishermen do report is very often there will be holes in the nets that are caused by something breaking through. And we think that is probably the adult males, which are larger and stronger than the females and the subadults. Now for some behavior, which I know I'm reaching the hour in 10 minutes, so I will. Fair enough.
It's okay.
But brilliant. Yes. So part of what we do, of course, when looking at these birds that get caught, is look at the diet. What are they eating? And here you can see me. This is just a still of when I was teaching students about how to cut open and look at the this is preparing the skins, but in the same thing we take out the stomach, we prepare the stomach contents, we look at that, we look at the otoliths, we have an otolith collection to look at what species they're eating, and and we're also comparing this also to what target species the fishermen are fishing, to see, well, is the grebe eating the same fish that the fishermen are interested in eating and catching, or is this sort of a myth by the fishermen? And One thing that really surprised us from this, and I'll be honest, I was not expecting this at all, because every record before this, including Fjeldza, when he did stomach content analysis in the 70s, said that this is basically an obligate piscivorous species. You'd occasionally see some evidence of eating invertebrates, but for the most part, it's piscivorous. And what we actually found is that amphipods, insects, mollusks are incredibly important, and that this actually varies by age. And fish seem to actually be a relatively small part of the diet. Now, this, I suspect, just comparing to the results from the 70s, is a product of fisheries populations collapsing. So we don't have good fisheries population data, but we have fisheries catch data going back to the late 1990s in the lake of recorded fisheries catch, which again ignores the majority of it, but hopefully the trend is correct, which suggests that there's been a decline in absolute fish biomass in the lake, which has been quite significant. So the grebe probably prefers to eat fish, but in the absence of fish will eat these other things. And Fjeldza only looked at adults. He didn't look at juveniles. We've caught some juveniles, so we've also looked at juveniles. Perhaps unsurprisingly, fishermen don't try to capture amphipods and mollusks. They're too small, they're not that important. And fishermen tend to want to go for pejerrey or trout or these other larger species. Now, funnily enough, we haven't actually found much evidence of the grebe eating even the fry of trout. Occasionally you will see some evidence of that, but not much, which we're not entirely sure why that is. You think they would be able to do so. So if you have some ideas about that, do let us know. Now, we also have data on other grebe species, and it is true that the Titicaca grebe eats more fish than the other grebe species. But it is, and this is older data. We now have newer ones, but I just don't have as nice a graph of it. But the trend generally holds that Rolandia microptera eats more mollusks and eats more fish than the other grebe species found in Lake Titicaca, while the other ones like Podiceps occipitalis seems to be very much a specialist in small invertebrates. And Rolandia roland is basically an amphipod specialist. We are following this up with stable isotope work because, as you know from stomach content analysis, that has its own biases. And unfortunately, the stable isotope work can only really work on the fish because of two things. First of all, you may have noticed I use very broad invertebrate categories. The vast majority of the invertebrate species in this lake have not been described. We know of some of them. Very often in the literature about this lake, you'll see amphipod species number 17 because we know it's a different species, but no one's written a formal description. If any taxonomist wants to do your budding taxonomist wants to do a doctoral dissertation on this, I'm sure that you'll find colleagues more than willing to give you just specimen after specimen. But the stable isotope work will hopefully let us look at the diet a bit more, and we have been doing that not just on contemporary samples, but also museum samples. And the reason for that is that we want to see has the diet of not just the grebe, but various other species shifted in response to the introduction of trout. Sorry, my throat is... And the preliminary results is that it has. But again, this is preliminary results. When we were in the field, we were monitoring the nests. Here you can see an example of a Titicaca grebe nest. As you can see, it's a very elaborate contraption. And we monitored for one breeding season because that's what we had funding for. Ideally, we will get more funding in the future to look at other breeding seasons. We've now established that the grebe has a breeding season, which is good to know, and established things like average clutch size and all those things which you assumed were done in 1903, but had not been for this species. And what we see is that where fisheries are intense, you see more eggs in nests in areas where fishing is more intense, but a lower percentage of the eggs seem to survive, primarily due to, it seems to be that obviously fishermen are fishing where there's more fish. So that's obviously a better place to be a grebe as well because there's more food, but also a higher chance of mortality. And therefore, if the parent dies, well, the egg and the chick is also likely to die. This is a weird behavior, which we've seen, which I wrote a paper on. And if you want to really make people uncomfortable in cocktail parties, you can talk about it. Reverse mounting, which is a behavior found in a lot of grebes, but we hadn't actually found it in this grebe before, which, as you can probably guess from this image, it is a sexual behavior. But unlike where the male mounts the female, in this case, the female mounts the male. It's usually described as an aberrant behavior, but it was so common in so many pairs that we thought, well, this must have an adaptive purpose. And it seems to have one. And it seems to be that in pairs that have experienced nest failure once, the male will go off and try to find a younger female or another female to make a nest to see if they can reproduce. And of course, if you're the previous female, you don't want this. And this seems to be a way to increase the interest of the male back, rekindle something of that old pair bond. And the pairs that engage in this after nest failure are likelier to attempt to have an egg later on in the breeding season, which of course is suboptimal because that egg is less likely to survive than if the early one had survived, but it's better than nothing. So it does appear to be a adaptive behavior. I've spoken about the grebe for ages, and I'm wary of the time as well, so I can quickly go through this bit of the other birds of the lake, because there are other birds in this lake. The fisheries conflict is not unique to the Titicaca grebe, as you saw from the dead birds. Plenty of other birds get caught in the nets, and we can actually model the vulnerability because when we were doing our surveys, we didn't just say, oh, how many grebes are there? When we're already out in the field, you might as well count the other bird species that you have there. So we can do joint species distribution modeling. And then based on the data that we now have of fisheries bycatch, we can see, all right, what traits cause birds to be more vulnerable to bycatch, and then assign a vulnerability score to each one on a vulnerability index, and then model across where are they. And as you can see, the shallower you go, the more likely it is that you will get vulnerable birds. That's perhaps unsurprising. The shallower bits of the lake just have a lot more birds in them. But we can overlay this with where the fishermen are, and that gives us a map of conflict. So this is the likeliest places where you will get fisheries bycatch over the course of the lake, not just of the grebe, but of any species. And the greatest conflict on that. And that can be useful for policymakers for focusing where anti-bycatch efforts are done. And as you can see, it's almost all in this lower part of the lake. It's almost a sub-lake called Viñamarca, which, unlike the big lake, which has a maximum depth of nearly 200 meters, the small lake has a maximum depth of 6 meters. So it's a much shallower body of water. This is some work I've been doing a bit more recently. This is some work because I'm already in the field, I'm more than happy to help colleagues collect the data. And Kevin McCracken and Alexis Diaz are physiologists, which I'm not. But they asked me if I'd be possible for them to accompany me to collect blood samples to look at the physiology of these species, because obviously these are very high altitude species, which you wouldn't, and therefore the physiology is very weird. For instance, the standard model for oxygen getting into an egg breaks down at these altitudes because oxygen concentrations are so low. So studying its physiology can be quite interesting. But I admit, in this research, my role has been data collection and really sample collection. I've left the hardcore physiology to Kevin and Alexis. And also behaviors of other species. You may have seen in some of the photos, there are gulls, Laridae up here. The Andean gull only exists above 2,600 meters. It is a very poorly studied gull species because it was thought to be a subspecies until relatively recently, but then some genetic evidence showed actually it's very distinct. It's well adapted for high elevations. And we have evidence now that it is kleptoparasitic, and we have evidence that it also consumes the Titicaca water frog and also the chicks of the Titicaca grebe. And that's a paper that recently came out if you want to read about the novel behaviors of this species. So thank you to all the various funders and collaborators that I've worked with in this project, which you can see here. And of course, this project involved many people. Here's some of them, from my doctoral supervisor, Professor Gosler, to just so many Peruvian and Bolivian scientists who are absolutely amazing at what they do. And of course, thank you so much for your university for hosting this talk, and for the Oxford-Harkiv's Society for brokering this talk. And if you have any questions, ask them now, or if you come up with any questions later on, just here's my email, which you can send anything you want. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And we are open to the questions from audience. If anybody has a question, raise your hand. Yeah, Danilo.
I have some questions for our guest. I guess the question is very simple. What about the apex predators from fish? No, fish apex predators.
What about the fish apex? So like the trout?
Yes.
So, the trout, as I said, is non-native. It's an invasive species and has become the apex predator because it is a large carnivorous thing and is far larger than any other species found there. Before the introduction of trout, the apex predator was probably, and I have to say probably because we don't have modern style ecological studies of food webs done before this, before the introduction of trout in Lake Titicaca, Orestia scuvieri, which was the largest largest fish found in the lake. But that is not a very big species either. But we don't know much about the ecology of these fish, I'll be honest. Did that answer your question? Or?
I think so.
Brilliant. It seems like Volodymyr has a question.
Yes, I'm sorry. Am I fair to assume that this flightless grebes evolved from species that could fly, and this is how they were introduced to this lake?
Yes, so there's a very good paper by Livesey, the late Professor Livesey, who died 2 years ago, relatively young actually, on the evolution of flightlessness in grebes, because it's occurred multiple times. And it seems to be that grebes specialize in relatively energy-poor food sources compared to a lot of other bird species. And flight is a very energetically costly adaptation. So once they find us, if a lacustrine environment is stable enough over a geological period, they tend to evolve towards flightlessness. And this has happened in Lake Titicaca, in Lake Junín, in Lake Alotora, in Lake Atitlán, in Lake Tauta, and therefore, so yes, the ancestor of this grebe would have been a flying species.
Yeah, so my second question is, do we know how long this population that lives in Lake Titicaca lived there? So how long did this flightless behavior evolved?
So, as I say, we don't have the genetic data to do the proper phylogenetic stuff. I mean, the genetic data, I should say, today is the day that Hassel Gispe, one of our local collaborators, is flying out to Copenhagen to give Pete Hosner data, the blood samples to get the genetic data. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks we will have that. And that can hopefully answer the question of when it split off. That doesn't necessarily say when the flightlessness evolved, because obviously when it split off, it would have still been flying, probably.
Well, yeah.
We don't really have the zooarchaeological record, as you may know, doesn't preserve birds very well. There has been some work on paleontology and zooarchaeology of this region, and there was a paper by Kenton Stedman on back in 1999 reviewing all the bird finds that have been done there. Grebes were mentioned, but they're not very common in a lot of those. It's mainly Andean coots, which if you visit the region now, Andean coots are the most common bird species other than the Andean gull. And the Andean gull's population is probably artificially high because they've really learned how to exploit the human niche. So we really need to get more zooarchaeological and paleontological finds to be able to say, well, when do we see the morphological evidence of flightlessness evolving? I mean, obviously, you can do things like ancestral trait reconstruction, which would allow, and especially once we have that time-calibrated phylogeny, which is not based on morphology, but on the genetic data, we'll have a lot more confidence in that. But given that the lake in various forms has existed for a couple of million years, it has that constrains it, right?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Natalia?
Hello. I'm very grateful for very interesting lecture, and it was very comforting to hear about studying such endemic and exotic species faces the same challenging as studying our common species in ordinary Ukrainian water reserve. So you will have even maybe a greater problem with you and the goal judging with our resolve and its spreading process. But yes, I have a questions. The first, the questions about the grape has natural enemies beside fishmen, of course.
It doesn't appear to have any natural predators other than when it is a chick, it is predated upon. And there's one record done by Casey back in 1937 where he describes a hawk eating a grebe, grabbing a grebe. I've not observed this, so it's possible that they do that, and I perfectly believe it. But they're very rarely found in the wetlands, so they mainly prefer to be towards the towards the land side of things. That might be because it's just a lot easier to get food there.
Very shortly.
But other than that, no, it doesn't seem that they have many natural predators. And I should say, they really have a very poor anti-predator instinct. You can sort of go right up to them and pick them up and all that, which would indicate a species that evolved without natural predators, or with very few.
And my second question is about what happened in we have a picture with I forgot the name of this plant, with air water plant. You have a picture of distribution, and then we have some decreasing and 14 years or something like this. What happened with them in these years?
That was an ENSO event. So that was so you may be familiar with El Niño?
No. Niño, maybe, yes.
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 So basically, South America is subject to once every 6 to 8 years a massive climatological shift caused by essentially water, a movement of air that would normally be over Indonesia going to the coast of South America, which causes just a massive dry spell. And that's currently occurring.
And you have such on the pictures.
Yes, I can share my screen and maybe you can confirm it if it's the same one. It's is it share? Is it this one here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically,
it slides in Totora. Yes, I forgot just its name. What happened with Totora in this years? We have the same situation when there's very slight increase in 5 meters australis, for example. That's just but without such a I don't know what why.
The slight increase, ironically, might be anthropogenic because Totora is deliberately planted in some areas for cattle feed. And because the grassland around there doesn't actually grow that much cattle feed, but you can grow Totora and feed it to cattle. And there's been an increase of ranching in especially the more upland villages. So it seems to have been there's more planting of Totora than there used to be. So that might be, so the overall positive trend might be an anthropogenic effect. The declines in specific years are associated with years where there were particularly strong ENSO events, so climatological events. And that would suggest that is the driver. And we'll have to this year is a very strong ENSO. It's the strongest one since 1873, and we'll have to see the impact that has on the ecosystem. I mean, in the 1873 one, the water level dropped about 12 meters below what it is today. So that's, which also indicates just how volatile the water level is in the lake, that we have, in a very short time span, tens of meters difference of water level, which you don't get in Lake Windermere in England.
I think, thank you. Thank you. I understand.
Yes. And yeah, I think we all have the same problems when it comes to studying wild species, that they don't like to cooperate.
I have a question, if you
Yes.
do not mind. So more or less we are object-oriented scientists. So we try to understand something in the nature through the eyes of one particular species. I do that with vipera. Yeah? You do it with grabber. And I recognize the same problem and the same approach which is possible. I just might miss, did you do capture study? And can you infer the mortality rate in different areas of the lake affected by the fishery?
So we tried to get an ethical permit for a capture-recapture study. But because it is a critically endangered CITES species, the government did not give us an ethical permit for that.
Can you just paint a number of a grabber without catching it with a long brush?
So there's been attempts to capture them. There is, as you say, you can go up to them and pick them up, and it's usually fine, unless they have chicks. If they have chicks on their back, which is a common breed behavior, you have no chance in hell of grabbing them because they will dive and escape, and then sort of the maternal instinct kicks in, which I say maternal instinct anyway. But the short answer is no. Unfortunately, we were doing non-mark recapture. What we do have is just data of how often they're falling in nets from this pilot study we're doing with fishermen. And we also have, from visiting the nests time and time again, you can see the chicks, are they dead, are they alive? The eggs, have they hatched, have they not hatched? And you can get the juvenile mortality.
It's maybe not very efficient for this species. If they are spread after breeding very, very wild, it's not for birds, not for all bird species. If the species have a high level of philopatries, yes, but recapture is not for all water birds. For some, yes, but for grapes, it's maybe not good.
Well, this is part of the issue, that a lot of the basic natural history of the species isn't very well known. We do know, so it does appear that it is pair bonds. It appears that it's biparental care. Now, we also know that you have very often aggression between males over territory.
Yes.
And it does appear also that you have a larger number of unaffiliated males than females, especially. So if you go around, very often you'll see younger males that are sort of the younger adults without a territory. They're not nesting in the core Tutora area, and where they are where they are overnight, there's no females. So that would suggest possibly, maybe a polygynous mating system. However, without the marked recapture, which not very annoyingly, I understand why there's worries about capturing an endangered species and handling them when we don't, and especially things like we were proposing potentially putting GPS tags on them. And
No.
yeah, well,
maybe radio tags. I don't know.
The main issue, the Peruvian government is quite strict when it comes to animal ethics, and their main concern was, we don't know the effect that this will have on this particular species on mortality or anything like that. I think they're being overcautious, to be honest, but when you're working in a country, you need to obey the laws of that country.
Yes, yes.
I'm not going to be, I think the decision was a bit silly, but I wasn't going to break the law.
Okay.
Okay, Jorge has a question.
Yes, thank you, Daniel, for magnificent talk. I wanted to ask you about the kind of genetic variation within the grebe species. Like, have any studies been done on that? I think you've mentioned something on genetics, but I'm not sure if it relates directly to that. Like, I mean, if the population itself varied in their kind of in their genetic not outline, but yeah, like genetically varied, or they're quite homogeneous, and there are no markers into like breaking into subspecies or something like that.
That's not been done in this species. It's been done in Rolandia roland, which is the other member of the same genus, where you do see subspecies of that. There's one subspecies that's for the Falkland Islands, one for the Southern Andes, one for the Central Andes, one for the Northern Andes. Latin American countries make it very difficult to export biological specimens for DNA work, and that is specifically how the law is written. So if you want to... Obviously, I'm not against the Nagoya protocols. They're very important to prevent biopiracy and all that, but a lot of Latin American countries have sort of interpreted it as the most maximalist interpretations of it. So it's taken us 5 years to get one blood sample from Peru to Denmark. The stable isotope work, weirdly, was quite easy to get permits for, but only because we explicitly said we would not get DNA. So they're very strict about that, that if you need to sign saying that you will not do any genetic studies or any DNA studies on those samples that you're exporting, only stable isotope or whatever other methodology samples for.
Interesting.
Which is insane, but that's the law, and I want to continue working in Peru and Bolivia, so I'm not going to break the law by analyzing it. So we do. It's very frustrating. We have the samples, even after stable isotope. They sent us enough that we could look at genetic variation, but legally we can't. Hopefully, with this sample being sent to Denmark, hopefully, first of all, it will be fine and nothing goes wrong. But we will then be able to at least be able to see where this species is phylogenetically, but it's only one individual, right? So it doesn't necessarily tell us, it straight up can't tell us about population history, or it can't tell us about population connectivity, it can't tell us about movement, it can't tell us about all these things, which I would love to study, but unless there is a change of law, we won't be able to study, and I'm not seeing a change of law coming down the line in either Peru and Bolivia. I mean, the current president of Bolivia has abolished the Ministry of Environment, and that was the ministry that gave the export permits. So it's no longer possible to get an export permit from Bolivia because he fired everyone who does that. And the incoming president of Peru has promised to abolish the Ministry of Environment there as well. So it's actually quite dark times for environmental conservation in these countries.
Short remark. If you cannot bring samples to the sequencer in Europe, you can take a sequencer from Oxford Nanopore and bring to Titicaca Lake and sequence it on a site.
That would be ideal, and hopefully we'll be doing that, working with the geneticists. I mean, my background is in behavioral ecology, not genetics, unfortunately. My master's thesis was on the behavior of crickets, which very fun. Yes, I know. Recently published, finally. Only took 6.5 years to get that work done. Get the work published. It sort of went through, yeah.
But I just wanted to ask, do you have any feeling that there could be subspecies, or like that there could be genetic variation in the population?
I would be very surprised, because it's found in only one. It has a very concentrated geographic range. As far as we know, it has always had a very concentrated geographic range and a small population. And it almost certainly was subject to a founder effect when it was established. And we know from the paleoecological record that it's always been a very volatile lake, where water levels go up and down by tens of meters, over the span of hundreds or thousands of years. At the highest point, the lake was nearly 150 meters higher than it is today, its water level. And at its lowest point, which the maximum depth of the lake is about 200 meters, it was nearly 70 meters lower than it is today, and it was broken up into several smaller lakes. And if this species is about as old as the average vertebrate species, around 150, 200,000 years, that means it would have survived through all that change, which means it would have had multiple population crashes where genetic diversity would have just collapsed, and whatever survived is the source of the genetic material since. So if I had to, but that's pure speculation on my part, maybe one day we will get the legal authority to do genetic diversity and we'll find out actually it's 10 different cryptic species and we've been wrong this entire time.
Alexandra holding a hand for a while, and then
I want to ask a question. I want to ask if Titicaca grebes can no longer walk on land because they evolved to swim, and how good of a swimmers does it make them?
Yes, so they've evolved to swim, and they're ruddy good swimmers. They're almost ungangly on the surface. They're not the most elegant paddlers, and no doubt you will have seen the elaborate courtship dance of grebes in Europe, which I believe in Ukraine you also have the grebes that do that. They don't do those elaborate courtship dances. They do a very simple courtship dance. But underwater, because the water can be relatively clear, especially in the shallow areas, you see them go as fast sometimes as some of the smaller boats that we have. And they can be underwater for, I've timed them, and they can be underwater for 8, 10, 12 minutes at a time.
Okay, thank you. And I have one a bit dumb question. How do they get into their nests and don't break their legs because they cannot walk on land?
This is common in a lot of grebe species and also some coots. They sort of have first of all, the nest I showed was sort of one which the water level had dropped to the point that it couldn't get back in. And this is an issue that we're seeing. But when it's sort of as they like it, the nest is quasi-submerged. So it's almost a depression with a ramp that lets them sort of swim up onto it, and then it's quasi-submerged there. And it's just enough to make sure that the eggs don't float off into the ether, into the wider lake.
Okay, thank you very much.
Alexei?
Yes, thank you so much, dear Mr. Villar, for a splendid lecture. It's been really interesting. I was chatting with Mr. Georgi Pervushin that I was writing my master's thesis on eco-linguistics. So the green topic, the green agenda, is not far from me. I'm particularly interested in how do you envision, media framing of the issue of losing and problems with biodiversity in Titicaca Lake. Do you see a lot of reports in the local media or international media? Because it is one of the, I understand, truly precious natural reserves with their own biota and so on. Thank you.
So I've done God knows how many interviews at this point in the local press. So I'm despite my accent, I was born in South America and I'm a native Spanish speaker, which helped ever so slightly to do the work, I'll be honest. And I speak passable Quechua and Aymara, the two indigenous languages of the region. So I've often appeared on the local radio programs and television programs. And you do get a positive response from some people, a negative from others. I'm sure if you've done public outreach, you're familiar with all sorts of responses from the public. The main thing that helps the biodiversity conservation agenda in this particular region is, first of all, local pride, especially when people learn that you have something unique here, because a lot of people don't realize that. And this is common problem working in unique ecosystems all over the world. I'm not sure if you've read Redmond O'Hanlon. He did some work on gorilla conservation in the Congo, and he has an anecdote of how when he was first out there, he was asked by a local person, "I don't get why you English come here to see gorillas. You're a rich country, you must have loads of them," which... Yeah, so very often getting people to realize, no, actually, there's something special here is the first barrier. But once people realize that, they become a lot more interested.
Yeah.
At least in my experience. And also linking it a lot to moral frameworks which people already have. So in this part of the world, you have a lot of nature worship. So the Pachamama, which is an earth goddess, which is associated with the Virgin Mary. So you have a syncretic indigenous Catholic religion, which is what most people have there. And a lot of good biodiversity conservation has come out of linking, protecting biodiversity to this spiritual dimension.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not reading comments, and Georgi suggested people to introduce themselves, so to give a speaker an impression who was the auditorium. We can do it afterwards if you like. And Danila, Alexandra, Natalia, and Vladimir and Alexei may say who they are, and that's may improve the situation. Danila.
I am first-year student from Pedagogical University, named after Skovoroda.
No, thank you. Alexandra?
I'm studying in Karazin University in Kharkiv.
Yeah, biology student, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Natalia?
I am a researcher and ornithologist from Shmalgausen Institute of Zoology in Kiev. And I study, my main object of study is water birds, yes.
Yes.
Colonial water birds.
Vladimir? Alexei?
Yeah, so my name is Alexei Zinyakin. I am the postgraduate student at Grigoriy Skovoroda, Kharkiv National Pedagogical University. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, we might have covered the questions which from the auditorium and may approach the end of our meeting. I'm very grateful to organizers, to Georgi, who initiated this lecture, and also want to thank very much Daniel for amazing talk, which not only brings us to Oxford and then to Titicaca Lake from different places where we are now, but also show us that there is much in common between our research and what you are doing. So it's very encouraging and feel us part of the bigger community. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And as I say, if any of you want to send me an email or want to collaborate, do let me know. And we're all scholars in the Republic of Letters, to use a very old-fashioned phrase.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Daniel.
Very much.
Thank you so much. And also on behalf of our association here in Kharkiv, I would like to extend the words of cordial gratitude to you, Mr. Daniel Villar, to Georgi Pervushin, esteemed moderator, Mr. Alexander Zinenko, all participants, the Vice Chancellor of the University, and everybody engaged in this wonderful lecture. I hope this is just like Mr. Alexander Zinenko